Population. Populations can affect economic outcomes by their size, their demographic characteristics, or their mobility, among other factors. The concentration or dispersion of a population can also greatly affect economic progress, which often varies with the degree of urbanization. Either the physical or the social separation of different segments of a country's population can also affect the extent of their cooperation and coordination in economic activities. Population size. The danger of overpopulation has long been a recurrent concern, even before Malthus raised his historic alarm at the end of the 18th century that the number of human beings threatened to exceed the number for which there was an adequate food supply. At various places and times throughout history, famines have been monumental tragedies that some have regarded as confirmation of Malthus's theory. As late as the 20th century, a famine in the Soviet Union under Stalin took millions of lives, and in China under Mao, tens of millions. But even catastrophes of this almost unimaginable magnitude do not prove that the world's food supply is inadequate to feed the world's population. Famines in particular countries or regions are often due to factors at work in those particular countries and regions at the time, such as a local crop failure or the disruption of transportation due to war, weather, or other causes. In the case of the Soviet Union, the famine was concentrated in a region, the Ukraine. That was before, and is again today, a major producer and exporter of wheat. Crop failures are not sufficient by themselves to bring on famine, unless food from other parts of the world cannot reach the stricken areas in time, and on a scale sufficient to head off mass starvation or the diseases to which undernourished people become vulnerable. Poor countries lacking transportation networks capable of moving vast amounts of food in a short time have been especially susceptible to famines. The modern transportation revolution has reduced such conditions over most of the world. But a country or region isolated for political reasons can remain susceptible to famine, as in the Soviet Union under Stalin and China under Mao. After radical changes in China's economic system in the decades following the death of Mao, an estimated 1/4 of China's adults were overweight by the early 21st century. Contrary to Malthusian theory, few, if any, countries have had a higher standard of living when their population was half of what it is today. Studies based on empirical evidence show results very different from those projected by advocates of overpopulation theories. For example, between the 1890s and the 1930s, the sparsely populated area of Malaysia, with hamlets and fishing villages, was transformed into a country with large cities, extensive agricultural and mining operations, and extensive commerce. The population rose from about 1.5 to about 6 million. The much larger population had much higher material standards and lived longer than the small population of the 1890s. Since the 1950s, rapid population increase in densely populated Hong Kong and Singapore has been accompanied by large increases in real income and wages. The population of the Western world has more than quadrupled since the middle of the 18th century. Real income per head is estimated to have increased by a factor of 5 or more. Nevertheless, overpopulation theories of poverty have endured and have had sporadic resurgences in the media and in politics, much like theories that we are running out of various natural resources. Moreover, the arguments are similar in both cases. The indisputable fact that there are finite limits to the amount of each natural resource has led to the non sequitur that we are nearing those limits. Similarly, the indisputable fact that there are finite limits to the number of people that the planet can feed has led to the non sequitur that we are nearing those limits. Poverty and famine in various parts of the world have been taken as evidence of overpopulation. But poverty and famine have been far more common in such thinly populated regions as sub-Saharan Africa than in densely populated Western Europe or Japan, which each have several times as many people per square mile as in sub-Saharan Africa. Travelers in Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages often commented on the large amount of land that was unused in this poorer part of Europe. While today there are densely populated poor countries like Bangladesh, there are also sparsely populated poor countries like Guyana, whose population density is the same as that of Canada, which has several times as large an output per capita and one of the highest standards of living in the world. In short, neither high population density nor low population density automatically makes a country rich or poor. What seems to matter more is not the number of people, but the productivity of those people, which is dependent on many factors, including their own habits, skills, and experience. To the extent that population density, as in urban communities, can facilitate the development of human capital, people in small, isolated societies have tended to lag behind the general progress of others. Population movements. While peoples in different regions of the world might live, and their cultures and societies evolve in their own respective regions for millennia, at various times they have also moved to other regions of the world, whether as conquerors, immigrants, or slaves. Some have migrated singly or in families, and others have migrated en masse, whether settling among existing inhabitants or driving the existing inhabitants out and displacing them, as invaders from Asia in centuries past set off chain reactions of population displacements in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, or as invaders from Europe would later displace indigenous populations in North America. In the early years of the Industrial Revolution, when technology advanced through the direct practical work of people in factories, mines, and other productive facilities, rather than through the application of science, as in latter times, the movement of migrants was the principal means of diffusion of technology from its sources to other nations and regions. Thus, British technological advances could spread more readily to an English-speaking country like the United States than to nearer countries on the continent of Europe. The government of Britain, where the Industrial Revolution began, tried to restrict the movement of British workers to other countries in order to protect Britain's technological advantages. However, as technological advances became more and more a matter of applying science, knowledge could more readily be spread on paper, rather than requiring the actual movement of people. Improvements in transportation and communications during the 19th century also sped up the diffusion of technological advances. By 1914, British advances in technology had spread not only to nearby countries, but across the continent of Europe. In countries around the world, the movement of peoples is also a movement of their cultures. This can result in a displacement of existing cultures at their destination, a planting of a new culture in the midst of one already in place, or an assimilation to the destination culture by the migrants. These varied prospects add more combinations and permutations to the possibilities affecting economic and social development, making equal development among regions, races, and nations even less likely than with geographic or cultural differences alone. Sometimes the newcomers end up adopting the culture of the surrounding society, beginning with the language, as most of the millions of immigrants to the United States did in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In other cases, however, such as the settlement of Western Europeans in Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages, the migrants retained their own language and culture for centuries, and to some extent assimilated members of the indigenous population to the transplanted cultures. This was especially so when the transplanted peoples were more prosperous, more highly skilled, and better educated. People who may be very poor in their native lands can sometimes prosper in some other lands which have more promising geographic or other advantages that the migrants have the human capital to benefit from, often more so than the indigenous inhabitants. For generations it was a paradox that the Chinese and Indians prospered almost everywhere around the world, except in China and India. As late as 1994, 57 million overseas Chinese produced as much wealth as the 1 billion Chinese in China. However, major economic reforms in China and India, beginning in the late 20th century, brought much higher economic growth rates in both countries, suggesting that their domestic populations, as well as their overseas offshoots, had potentialities that required only a better setting in which to reach fruition.